Hello, good morning, friends. So today we are going to discuss several issues in Amitav Ghosh narrative, and as you know that we are continuing with our lesson with Amitav Ghosh shadow lines, and today I will discuss briefly about the sociological and the cultural upbringing that propelled Amitav to write shadow lines in 1988. So let's come to the brief historical survey of Amitav Ghosh, and then I will show you how different factors are interpenetrating the narrative of Ghosh, the shadow lines. And as I know that I have already explained the significance of the title of Ghosh novels, why it's the shadow lines, why it's not a shadow line, or why what is the role of this definite article the in shadow lines, and how the different lines intercut each other, crisscross each other. So Amitav Ghosh narrative deals with a series of crisscrossing, intersecting lines which make it a very delightful as a novel, as a narrative. So the narrative is not a teleological narrative of memory where there is a proper beginning, proper middle, or proper end. Rather, it's the narrative is quite intersectional, and where you find different voices, different aspects coming together in order to form to quote Amitav Ghosh, a patchwork of memory. So there, the novel thrives on this patchwork. It sustains the patchwork of memory. So this is how Ghosh depicts most of his narrative technique. All right. If we go back to Ghosh's first novel, in the Circle of Reason, in the Circle of Reason, Ghosh uh, posits a subject, a liminal subject called Alu, who Alu is the name of the character, who remains mediated by the contradictory pools of Western rationality and Indian belonging. So, Western rationality and Indian belonging remains a dyad within which Ghosh characters remained located. Ghosh characters remain embedded. In an antique land, you find Ghosh another work in an antique land. You find there is a debate between the central character, who is a historian, and also there is another ethnographer. So in an antique land you find Ghosh tendency, or Ghosh narrative veers towards the exploration of a debate between historiography and ethnography. So how the thin line between historiography and ethnography can be drawn is in Gross narrative is shown in an antique land. Okay, so let's come back to the shadow lines again. In the shadow lines, you know that Trideep, uh, Trideep around which the narrator builds his memory is a perpetual absentee in the novel. However, despite being a perpetual absentee, Trideep remains a constant point of reference in the shadow lines. If we read the first few pages of the novel, it's clear that how the memory of Trideep is grafted onto the consciousness of the narrator. How the narrator patterns himself, how the narrator posits himself, how the narrator projects himself in the light of Trideep. So Trideep becomes what Minakshi Mukherjee calls the mirror image for the narrator, and Vis-a-vis Trideep, the narrator identifies himself the mirror image. Why the mirror image? Because in reality, going back to Trideep is not possible. Going back to Trideep is not possible because Trideep life is lost in the riot. And that is the reason why the narrator relies heavily on, or depends heavily on the tool of imagination to create a bridge between the reality and unreality, the the fictional and the spectral. So Trideep remains a spectral echo in the novel, and in Ghosh novels, in Ghosh narrative, this spectral presence, this idea of dealing with absent characters who are perhaps dead, who are perhaps no longer there, is a constant motive. Even in the Circle of Reason, also, you find Ghosh dealing with such a character, Ghosh dealing with such a character in the context of Alu's uncle who loses his life. So, this is how the characters who are not there, characters who perhaps have lost their lives, become so important in the narrative. And due to this relative parameter of importance of the characters who are present and who are absent but perpetually present, this interplay between uh, the characters makes Ghosh narrative so interesting, Ghosh narrative so heteroglossic and heterotopic at the same time. Here you find Ghosh narrative incorporates, embraces people from different times, different spaces, different origins, different cultures, and all of them coming together, breaking, questioning and dabbling with the notion of a complete historical teleology, complete historical linearity. So Ghosh rather quite deliberately plays with the question of linearity, quite deliberately plays with the question of teleology in order to instill the fact that how history creeps into the narration and how narration is intrinsic to history. So both are happening simultaneously in the novel. First, how history becomes important to narration, and secondly, how narration becomes key to history, and both of them become implicated within each other. Both of them remain implicated within both of them remain implicated within a singular framework, and this is how Ghosh heterotopia is built. This is how Ghosh heterotopia challenges the underlying assumption of homotopia, that the nation is, or an imaginative community that the nation is supposed to be. So the question of homotopia, that the nation is supposed to be that there are similar set of peoples, similar groups of people, and there should be a sense of community building that Benedict Anderson calls the imagined community, and so on and so forth. That question of homotopia gets questioned by this heterotopic presentation of character, where multiple times, multiple spaces, multiple characters intersect. And as I told you a few minutes back about the about that novel, that the Circle of Reason, here Ghosh consciously departs from the reason propounded by the grand narrative of reason propounded by Western modernity. Western modernity is falling flat in order to measure the existence of characters. And that's why Ghosh breaks away from the paradigm of Western modernity. In this novel, also, Trideep as a character departs from the convention, departs from the laws of Western modernity, and Trideep is someone who flouts, as I told you in my last few classes, that who systematically flouts, who systematically contravenes, who systematically eludes the laws that are intrinsic to colonial governmentality. And that's why Trideep's self fashioning is something very unique, something very uncharacteristic to his times. And as you find out that the role of Maya Devi, role of Thamma, and all the other characters are very different from Trideep. Trideep fashions himself in a completely different way. Trideep is someone who creates a new space by walking the city. The South Kolkata region, Gol Park, Southern Avenue, Rabindra Sarobar Lake, all this become so vibrant due to Trideep's presence. So Trideep's subjectivity leads to the exploration of the city, and the city becomes so important to Trideep's upbringing. So Trideep as a character leads to the formation of a city space in the novel. He street walks the metropolis, and his subjectivity the develops, remaps the metropolitan city from a different perspective where the subjective experience informs the spatiality, the spatial experientiality of a city. So it's not the it's there. So there is a crucial departure from the Henri Lefebvrean framework, where Henri Lefebvre is all about is talking about the social production of space. So here, more than social production of space, you find a personal production of space through Trideep. And Trideep is someone who is constantly engaging in this personal exploration of the city. And by engaging in this personal exploration of the city, he is conforming to the Descartes framework of exploring the city differently, subjectively, very differently from the social and the political dimension of the city. So there is a personal politics involved in Trideep's character, and the narrator quite curiously, quite interestingly valorizes this aspect of personal factor of Trideep's character in order to show or in order to show or foreground how all these things remain implicated within the framework, within the remain implicated within the framework of this novel. So let me come to this point again. The point that I'm trying to make here is Trideep's exploration of the city space or projects the city or projects Kolkata quite differently from the conventional norms of representation. Kolkata is or has been projected. If you go back to the films of Satyajit Ray or Mrinal Sen or Ritik Ghatok, if you go back to the film culture, film society movement of 1970s or early 1970s mostly. If you go back to them, or if you watch the film Akale Shandhane by Mrinal Sen, so what you find is Kolkata as a city is a very dominant political entity. Kolkata as a city is a dominant political entity. The political presence of Kolkata is so pulsating, is so vibrant that it influences the characters. Even if you listen to Shuman's song, Kobi Shuman's Gun, that Kolkata has a very instrumental role in shaping the contours of one's psyche, let's say, of one's psychic development, interior development. So Kolkata has radical political presence as a space. So, and it goes with the social production of space, how different, in different ways, the space is produced socially, and how it acts as a social marker, Henri Lefebvre talks about. Here, in this novel, rather we find a subjective exploration of the city, where the social production of space, as propounded by Henri Lefebvre, is uh, is uh, is uh, is departed away from, pardon me, is departed from. And here rather we find an a deeply personal engagement with the city space. And it's the disheartened framework that the narrator is trying to I won't say the narrator is trying to show any framework. Rather, it's the Saturn framework within which the narrator remains located. So from the Lefebvrean framework, there is a departure towards the Desartouan framework. And now let's come to another point. And if we look at the timing of the novel, 1988, and before this, in 1984, the 1984, you find there is a political tension brewing within the nation after the death of Indira Gandhi. Also, there was the Sikh riot, the Sikh riot, which led to an unprecedented calamity to the Indian nation. And Ghosh writer, is growing up, or Ghosh as a figure, as a novelist, is growing up in that very volatile, very upsetting cultural scenario. And although Ghosh belongs to upper middle class Vodrulok family, he does not remain impervious to these political, cultural, and social changes that remain intrinsic to his times, that remain central to his times. And that's why perhaps Trideep dies suddenly in the novel due to a riot. And I don't know whether this riot is influenced by the 1984 problems or 1984 tensions. Perhaps it was quite deliberately, perhaps Ghosh translocates the narrative to a different time altogether, to a different space altogether, in order to camouflage the contemporary social problem. But I presume, I think that these problems that Ghosh narrative addresses, these problems that Ghosh narrative deals with, are still relevant to his times, still relevant to the space from which he writes. You can find a critique of Ghosh, because Ghosh narrator is writing from the perspective of an upper middle class Bengali woman, sorry, upper middle class Bengali man and Bengali woman. So Ghosh narrator is an upper middle class Bengali, ultimately an upper middle class Bengali citizen. So, if we go back to the history again, then after 1970s, 1980s too was quite politically volatile. 1980s too was a politically vibrant time where you find so many subaltern groups reasserting their claims, and also you find a transnational audience, a transnational public sphere is developing, the culmination of which we find in the 1991 economic liberalization, which opens India to transnational capital. So, if we look at the setting of the novel, it's Kolkata and it's London, Kolkata and London. So this Kolkata centricity and this uh, setting of the narrative in London underscores one fact, that the target audience that Ghosh had for his novel, The Shadow Lines, were predominantly upper class, upper middle class, bourgeois, bhadralok families who had, but who would feel some sort of relatability to this content, to its content, to its development of character. So 3D, despite being quote unquote a deterritorialized subject, remains much more embedded, remains sorry, let me reframe it. Trideep, despite being a deterritorialized quote unquote subject, remains quite embedded in the social and political dynamics of the times. And Ghosh quite clearly, through the reflection of Trideep, tells a story of his own alter ego, of being a globetrotter, even now, if you come back to Ghosh novels like The Gun Island, or his Ibis trilogy, or the last one, the verse, it's written in verse, Jungle Nama, you find the ethnographer Ghosh is ethnographer or anthropologist Ghosh is jostling spaces with the novelist Ghosh. So there is a curious interplay between ethnography and narration in Ghosh novel, recent novels. But if we go back to Trideep was perhaps that ethnographer in the making, and Trideep was perhaps that globetrotter in the making. So I find a very curious reflection of Satyajit Ray in Amitav Ghosh. And uh, as we find out the character Monmohan Ghosh, for that matter, sorry, not Monmohan Ghosh, Monmohan Mitra, for that matter, in Agantuk 1991, what we encounter, what we come across in 1991's film, Monmohan Mitra in Agantuk, is a globetrotter, is someone who travels across the world, and finally comes back as an atithi. Atithi means who does not have a particular tithi, who does not have a particular direction, particular debt. So the concept of atithi and the concept of traveler go hand in hand, each other, go hand in hand, because atithi is someone who is not measured or not mapped by any chronological boundary, and this chronological boundary, this overwhelming dependence on the sense of the economy of time, is predominantly a western import. And Trideep also belongs to that paradigm, who is not measured, who is not mapped by, who is not restricted within this colonial paradigm of chronology, paradigm of chronology, and that's why he becomes a perpetually present character in the consciousness of the narrator. That's why the laws of linear, cartographical, chronological time are subverted through the invocation of a much more circular, oral, and non-cartographical time. So the shadow lines, the lines that are drawn concretely, along the borders of India and Bangladesh, become so porous to the memory, so porous to the experience, to the suffering of the individual characters who live their life. So the idea of lived experience and the idea of memory all come into play, all collide with each other in Ghosh narration, where the individual, the personal, always contest the political rather than the political contesting the personal. Obviously, the political has an influence on the personal, has has an impact on the personal issues in the text, but it's rather the individual or the personal that determines the political. And Ghosh narrator Trideep belongs to that upper middle class Bhadralok narrator, the Bhadralok family, to which Ghosh himself belongs. Ghosh stems from or hails from an upper middle class Bhadralok gentle family. And Ghosh narrator also shares that sentiment. Ghosh Trideep, the alter ego, also shares that sentiment. And why there is a mirror image in this formation in this novel? Because a mirror image gives the narrator a some sort of ontological positionality in the text, that uh, the narrator is unnamed, right? Since the narrator is unnamed, the narrator has to situate himself in the course of the novel, situate himself in the entire framework of the novel, and uh, to situate himself in the entire framework of the novel, the narrator needs an identity marker, and this identity marker happens to be Trideep in this text. Trideep becomes the mirror image of the narrator, and Trideep becomes the image through which the narrator positions himself. So, if we go back to the Lacanian conception of mirror stage, and if we find that the mirror stage gives gives the narrator, sorry, not mirror stage, gives the child and gives the child an ontological validity of its position, that the child is different from the mother. So it's projected by the mirror, that the mirror shows the child, that how the child is actually an individual is different from the mother. Similarly, it's happening here as well. The narrator remains so much embedded in the identity of Trideep that Trideep is being used as a mirror image in this novel, where through which the identity of the narrator is ontologically established, that you are, as a narrator, you are different from Trideep, as a narrator you are different from other people, but the narrator does not have any ontological identity. If you remember, the narrator remains an unnamed narrator, the I narrator and the unnamed narrator, and the narrator remains crisscrossed by several emotions, several sentiments, several ideas, where spatiality, temporality, cultures, politics, personal emotions, all of this intermingle. all of this interplay. So this curious patchwork of memory that Amitav Ghosh, The Shadow Lines, promotes is born out of this narrator's dilemma that whether he should be located in the present or he should be located in the past. Without resolving this dilemma, the novel actually deals with time in a very entangled manner, where the past and the present cannot be separated, separated as isomorphous categories, separated as discrete categories. Rather, the past and the present remained constantly entangled within the novel, and that's how it helps them, it helps the characters, it helps the narrator to shape his own identity, his own sensibility. So let me quote a few portions from a text of Amitav Ghosh, from the biography of Amitav Ghosh. Let me read it. Calcutta, his native city, exerts a powerful influence on Ghosh's imagination. Its presence is marked and mediated by birth into what is known as the Bhadralok, the upper and the middle sections of Bengali society that emerged in the 19th century as a consequence of the reorganization of the Bengal economy under colonial rule. Roughly translated, the term means gentle folk, and the Bhadralok of Kolkata constitutes Bengal's intellectual, cultural, and the political elite. And though at its lower reaches, the economic position of many Bhadralok families can often be precarious, a situation that is memorably captured, as Minakshi Mukherjee observes, in the precise class positioning of the uh, anonymous narrator of the shadow lines, whose family is quote unquote Bengali Bhadralok, starting at the lower edge of the spectrum and ascending to its higher reaches in one generation, with family connection above as well as below its own station. So, quite clearly, if we read the light from Minakshi Mukherjee's perspective, Meenakshi Mukherjee is one of the foremost Indian critics on Indian English novel, and she focuses on the class position of the narrator. The class position of the narrator remains also quite fluid, and it shows that how the narrator has connections over their connections over and above their own class strata. That is, they are connected to people like Trideep, they are connected to people like Maya Devi, and also they have connections below their station. That means they are also connected to the lower rungs of the society. So this mobility, this socio-cultural mobility the narrator epitomizes, is something quite interesting. It's something quite interesting according to Mukherjee, and it's also symptomatic of the upwardly mobile journey of the Kolkata elites in the 1980s, who had their connection both beyond and within the city. And that's how they would flourish within a span of one generation, from rags to riches. So this within a time of one generation, and this journey from rags to riches, not riches. This journey from rags to riches. So this is something very interesting, and this is something that remains quite significant to the poetics of Amitav Ghosh novels, and also the travel becomes a key register, or travel emerges as a key register of Ghosh awareness of the importance of space in human experience, as I told you, that how it's different from Descartes, different from Lefebvre's idea of the social production of space, and social production of space, and also in his recognition, the space is not an inert physical dimension exterior to human consciousness, but is rather intimately shaped by the particular ways in which it is imagined, that determines the examination of the culturally created spaces. So the imagined spaces play a crucial role in Ghosh narratives. That the spaces that are perhaps not in reality, the spaces that are perhaps not in actuality, the spaces that remain entirely within your consciousness. All these spaces determine or shape your identity in the text, in the context of the shadow lines. Quite clearly, quite interestingly, shadow lines deals with this multiple spatialities, multiple temporalities, and it shows how space cannot be an inert reality. Space cannot be an inert reality independent of human consciousness. It shows how space quite firmly interpenetrates, quite firmly test the border between the self and the other, around which the politics of the or the culture of the city is built. So this is how space is both exteriorized and interiorized in Ghosh fiction. And Kolkata as a city has a very uncanny presence in not merely the construction of Tridib, but also in the memory of the narrator. So the city becomes a city of memory where the actual or the historical and the imagined conflate, historical and the imagined coincide. And this is also a way of different lines intersecting. This is also a way of different axis of power, different axis of knowledge are coming together. And this is why the normal codification of the narrative around which a novel is usually written, the usual narrative of a novel, if we go back to the historical origin of the novel, it was a realist novel in England. It was a realist novel, and the sole purpose of the novel was to document the reality. The reality remains subservient within the narrative. So the role of the narrator was to document the reality. So the narrator was quite like an ethnographer. The narrator was quite like an anthropologist who would depict the nuances of the novel. And also there is another type of novel, or a sense of narrative, rather, I would say, in Indian style. In the Indian worldview, the novel, uh, which is of course an English import, came as a form of adaptation, came as a form of engagement, sorry, as a form of experimenting with the Western, as a form of experimenting with the Western form, with the Western technique. And it also emerged as a trope, emerged as a tool of empire writing back, empire giving it back to the colonial masters, colonial forefathers. So for the Indians, they derived the Western novel form. Also, they retain the indigenous forms like charit, indigenous form like folk tales and others, and their curious intermeshing led to the construction of a hybrid entity called Indian English novel, which is not, so to speak, which is not, so to speak, formally, socially realistic. If we go back to R.K. Narayan, for that matter, R.K. Narayan's Malguri is not a real space. R.K. Narayan's Malguri is totally fictional town. It's not located in a space like London, or a space like Dublin, uh, or a place like Kolkata. So it's Malguri is purely a fictional creation. Malguri is purely a figment of human imagination. So when you are, as a narrator, you are looking for an alternative topos for carving your niche, carving your narrative. That means you are searching for a narrative refuge where the narrative can have its essential function fulfilled, where the narrative can have its essential function fulfilled. And for the Indian narrator, the for the Indian narrative, the role of narration does not remain in documenting reality. In documenting reality, rather, Indian narration has always been a bridge between the inner consciousness and the outer world. The inner world and the outer world have always come together in Indian novels, be it English novels or Bengali novels. If you read Rabindranath's novels, Rabindranath's Upannash, you also find how in Ghore Baire, or in Gora, or in, let's say, Chaturango, or in Charodhai, the inner consciousness and the external world intertwine. The inner world and the outer world intertwine. Even in Bonkim also, you find a constant interaction between the. If you have read Rajmohan's Vibe, I know you have read Rajmohan's Vibe. There is a constant interplay between the inner and the outer world. Amitav Ghosh, although borrowing the Western novel form, is experimenting with the novel form and showing how time can be morphed, molded, molded and transformed in the narrative. The time of Amitav Ghosh narrative is a time of memory, it's not the time of history. And this time of memory often slips into the time of history, and the time of history often gets erased by this time of memory. So this interplay, this ongoing tension between the time of memory and the time of history, frames, contours Ghosh narrative, the shadow lines. And so in today's class, I have mostly focused on the time, the aspect of time, narrative, and speciality of Ghosh narrations. And in my next class, I will talk elaborately about the plot construction of the novel, how the novel uses a very intricate plot construction, and how in that plot construction Trideep remains both an absent and a present figure. So Trideep's absence is filled up by memory, the imagination of Tridip. So, how the plot of the novel brings together, how the plot construction of the novel brings together two contradictory threads of memory and history, actuality and imagination in the narrative, will be my area of engagement in the next class. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening, and hope you have something to get from this class. And please write back to me at my mail ID. Uh, Hope you have a very good morning, a very good day. Thank you so much for listening.